I wanted to start off this video by saying something funny, like how Jordan Peterson entered or sort of ended my dogmatic slumber, but I couldn't really find anything interesting except that, well, recent experiences ended my dogmatic slumber in, well, Jordan Peterson's ideas and concepts. So I thought I would work through Maps of Meaning and discuss it with you. I've written down a small essay based on his book. It's a summary and some critiques that I found combined with just my general worries about his work, or what at least caught my eye. And I was hoping that, well, via this medium we could just work through it. So the first thing that sort of introduced me to Jordan Peterson was the YouTube algorithm. So I was, I think, 15 or 16, maybe 17, when I sort of got into politics a bit more, and I sort of found out that there's a world beyond Lego and my computer games. And via the algorithm I got introduced to Jordan Peterson eventually. And to be fair, I'm a psychology student. I was looking up information around psychology, so that's also how I got introduced to him. And of course I was intrigued, as many young men are, or were at my age, into Jordan Peterson. And I don't think that there's necessarily something wrong with that. For the very elaborate critique on his ideas, well, I'm not that familiar with his sort of the statements that he made that made him controversial, so don't expect that from this video. Just expect me telling about what I found in the book and what my personal experiences are. But I started watching his videos. I read 12 Rules for Life. I haven't yet been able to read the other book, Beyond Order. And in general, I was just intrigued by his ideas, his idea of the archetype. Of course, he threw around some fancy names like Nietzsche, like Dostoevsky, names that well, weren't familiar with me, but sounded very cool. And well, let's just say that I ate quite a lot of lobster stew, and at I think, well, in 2020 I was full. I had enough. No, I started studying at university, and I just delved a bit more into literature and philosophy myself, and that also enriched quite a bit of my sort of worldview. And well, slowly but surely I moved a bit away from Jordan Peterson. And at a certain point, a friend of mine recommended to reread Maps of Meaning. I have a small reading group with two friends of mine, and one of them recommended to read this book again. And I said, yes, sure, let's go through it. But also because, well, over time I, well, went away from his philosophy a bit more, and that had to do quite a bit with his politics. So, well, of course he became famous via his politics, and if I remember correctly, it was a situation in Canada with pronouns. That didn't bother me at the time as much as it did now. And also, for example, I myself, if you may have heard it from the accent, I'm Dutch. And I was confronted and conflicted with quite a lot of, well, right-wing theories about a nitrogen crisis here in the Netherlands that I didn't fully agree with. It was a bit of a one-sided overview of what was happening. And I was wondering why Jordan Peterson would even bother, well, talking with the farmers here. Not that he shouldn't, but it's quite a nuanced issue. And he took a certain take that's also quite popular here in the Netherlands, and he showed it around the world, which is something that I found strange, because it isn't as nuanced as I, well, was used from him. So this made me wonder what his political roots actually were and are. Also, of course, he joined the Daily Wire, which made me even more intrigued to well, what his political roots are, and if I, well, sort of read past it, and now I could find it, for example, in then his magnum opus, Maps of Meaning. So that was the foremost reason for me to pick up the book and reread it. So I did that, and let's just walk through it slowly but surely. So Peterson starts off the book with a distinction. He states that life, how we live it, can be divided in two halves. So we have a factual scientific world, and we have an action world which is dominated by myths or mythology and story. So the world is divided between action and facts. And while we lay a lot of emphasis on the factual scientific world, we don't do that as much with the mythological action world. And according to him, we explore the factual world. So we explore just in general around the factual world that we live in. However, the meaning that we lay on the factual world is mythological, or is based on stories. So we lay down a certain meaning on the objects that surround us, and the context that surrounds us, and the people that we interact with, and the interactions that we have in general. So, and via these interactions, we of course lay more meaning upon the world. So Peterson comes up with quite an interesting story about a boy who is walking around in a room, and he touches the furniture around him, and so he learns quite a few things from the furniture that is around him. But then at a certain point, his mother sort of comes forward and takes his hand and says, "Oh no, don't touch this," because it was quite an expensive vase that the boy was trying to touch. And that, in very simple terms, is how Peterson sees that we sort of experience the world. So we live in interactions, and via these interactions we learn how to behave. So for example, the boy now knows that, for example, he should listen to his mother, that he should not touch the vase because it's special, or because it has value, or even that context, like, or that concept like value or something being special is something that is learned from that interaction. And that's how we consistently, over time, create meaning via interactions. And the way that we sort of surround ourselves within the world, in these interactions, is on a very low scale, but also on a meta scale. So these interactions and the meaning that we lay upon things is found within small interactions, like the boy who wants to touch the vase and gets told not to, which is a very small interaction that gives away a certain meaning. But also, for example, myself wanting to become a professor, for example, is a sense of meaning that I got from the world around me. It's something that I want because of the interactions that I had with the people around me within the society that laid a certain value on being a professor, for example. But that also indirectly affects everything I do. So for example, if I decide to read a lot of books because I, for example, want to be knowledgeable, because I want to become a professor, that's a meta goal that was shaped by the society and the culture that I live in, that shapes even the smallest interactions and things that I do. And that is what he calls myth or mythology. And it's a broader framework that just helps to shape and give ways to the developments and interactions that we have within the world. So it helps us to understand in what world we are living, how we should behave within the world and interact with things around us. So, as I just mentioned, small things we don't consciously think about, but it's motivated by myth. And try to think of myth not necessarily in a very sort of fantasy-like way. Try to bring it down to a level that you can conceptualize how, for example, a myth has shaped your consciousness. So what Peterson, for example, mentions is that there are certain layers of mythology and of ways that we behave. So, for example, he mentions that one of the basic layers is being a husband or a father, and that's shaped by the culture and the expectations around us. But above that, there's a layer which he calls the Judeo-Christian personality. So there are certain values and expectations and behaviors attached to that circle. And then the utmost layer, which is the most important layer that we will talk about quite a lot in the later parts of the video, is the hero's myth or the hero's journey. So, but we come there in a minute. Then Peterson also makes the distinction between rational myths and the myths of old. So the rational mythologies are the mythologies that can be summarized by communism and fascism. And those are deviations from the hero's path. So if one moves towards too much order, one gets into the way of fascism, while the other way around, one might get into the way of hedonism. And in general, it just made me wonder, what was quite interesting to me was that he mentioned that science cannot guide us in life because it's mostly factual. As we discussed, we have the factual and the action world, and science is mostly factual based. So it cannot give us the stories and the mythologies that we need to guide us in our lives. And this made me think of a quote by Wilhelm Dilthey. You can look it up, but it was, no real blood flows in the veins of the knowing subject constructed by Locke, Hume and Kant, but rather a diluted extract of reason as a mere activity of thought. If you find it interesting, look it up, but it related a bit towards this division of the factual world and the actual world, and science not being able to give a story that's important. So, very simple. How does mythology help us? Well, we have what is, which is chaos. Now, not necessarily chaos, but it's the world that is. And mythology helps us to envision a world that could be and how we can shape it. So via mythologies and stories, we are motivated to, or we can have a guidance in how to get to a certain point of how the world should be from what is at this point. So that's sort of the basic layer or the basic structure of the first chapter in Maps of Meaning. And then Peterson jumps over into a very psychological chapter, which is the chapter in which he tries to explain how the human brain and human cognition is constructed in such a way that this works, which is very interesting, very intriguing, and I enjoyed reading it quite a lot, but I will not delve too deep into the sort of psychological concepts that he discusses. But what he mentions is that just as the boy in the story learns via interactions, humans are naturally sort of intrigued by the unknown, by the mysterious, and we try to order and categorize the unknown into some form of order. And culture helps us in this. So via all kinds of different means, we are helped to bring order within our lives. So for example, he mentions imitation, play, but also philosophy, mythologies, and even mimesis, so the copying of things. In general, there are quite a few ways in which we get to experience new and or new ways on how to behave. The most basic way is indeed copying. So as a very small child, you look at the way, for example, people walk and you start copying it, or the way that people talk and you start to copy it. Play is also just a very basic way of finding out how to interact with other people, how to envision certain roles, and this is how we consistently shape order out of chaos. So as a child via play, but at a later point via science, rationalization, mythology, we find all kinds of ways to find and bring order within the chaos that we live in. And here, Peterson also brings up a concept of the eternal knower. So this is related to the meta mythology that we talked about earlier. It's the hero. He tries to sort of bring a balance between order and chaos. So to bring it down to a very simple example, we all are, in a sense, the hero. However, some people behave like it and others don't. And the hero's task is to be partly formed by culture and everything that surrounds us. So you can think of play, you can think of imitation, but in general, culture, mythology, it shapes us, it helps us to create how we should be, and then to step out of the familiar into the unknown. So culture gives us boundaries, but it also gives us the tools to develop how to behave within what is known, and it helps us to step outside what is known into the unknown, and to take something from the unknown that's new and to bring it back to the known. So it's a process of learning in general. It's not more complex than that. And then in the chapter after that, he makes a distinction between the core concepts that make up mythological thinking. So he gives 3 or 4 archetypes that are found in nearly every myth or mythology. So you have the primal source, which is sometimes mixed up with the Great Mother, but it's the primal source of chaos that surrounds everything. So it's the source of which the whole myth comes forth. Then you have the Great Father, which is related to order and culture, so the known. And you have the Great Mother, which is chaos and nurture or nature. And both the Great Mother and the Great Father can develop into to a positive and a negative aspect. So, for example, the Great Father can develop into the protective order, which we talked about. So it's the order that can help us with guidance within our lives. So how should we behave? How should we construct ourselves within society? And what are sort of the tools that we have to do that? But it can also develop into the tyrannical father. So that's the father that does not give any freedom for us to move around and keeps us within the ordered without being able to step into the unknown. And then the Great Mother can develop into promise and into threat. So we can gain something new from the Great Mother, but we can also be threatened by it. And then lastly, we have the hero. So that's the one who balances chaos and order. So it's the one who is shaped by the father and then interacts with the mother to gain new information. And these archetypes are transferred via, the means that we just talked about. So we have mythology, of course, but there are numerous sources in mimesis. We have imitation, we have play, we have just storytelling in general. There are all kinds of ways in which these sort of archetypes get transferred to us. But it is, according to Jordan Peterson, present in nearly every mythology. And here he makes a link towards Carl Jung. So he noticed that, for example, these archetypes are what he called heritable memories. So memories that we get from our parents, our grandparents, and that get transferred over time and over generations. So that's also connected to, for example, the collective unconscious. And to quote Peterson, the collective conscious is the cumulative transmitted consequence of the fact of the exploration and culture in action. So here we see that the collective unconscious is the accumulation, so just all the explorations that we did into the unknown brought back and gathered together into guidance that can help us. So for example, one very informative example that he gives is the concept of father or fatherhood. If you get confronted by an adult, a father, you see how he is as a father based on generations and generations and generations, so whole tradition of fatherhood over time. Because your father looked up towards his father, for an example, but also to other fathers, for an example, and maybe to books, and maybe to stories, and to myth or mythology. And this combined sort of the archetype of fatherhood that gets transmitted over generations and generations and generations. So you can see those archetypes really in such a way as cultural artifacts that gets transferred over time. And then Peterson talks about something that to me was very interesting, and that is in the introduction he talks about the absolute. So according to him, he found a absolute truth, which is something that in general just intrigues me. I always hope to find it. It would be very interesting if I could. But he states that he has found a myth like that. And well, we get there over time. But to summarize what we just talked about, in a very short sentence, in a sense, we are all actors learning how to act on stage. And our greatest guide is on how to act is found by looking back at mythology and history to chase or to trace patterns. So we are born. I don't know if I can say that we are born as a blank slate, but we are born. We look around, categorize things, and gain most of the information from culture and mythology and the stories that surrounds us. And those give us the guidance on how to act. And then Peterson starts to talk about society and how, for example, he finds a ideal society. And he states that it is quite difficult to talk about absolute truths. So if you talk about like a highest value or the highest good, he states that that's a solution to a meta-moral problem. And the meta-morality, which he talks about, and that we need to answer, is how or what is the behavior that we present that shapes the answers to, for example, questions like what's the highest good and what's the highest value. So the absolute morality, according to Peterson, and my apologies if I take a bit more time for this, but the answer is the hero's myth. So the eternal knower, or the meta-hero that we talked about. It's that process of the hero that is shaped by the culture that surrounds him, but who goes beyond the borders of culture to explore the new and the unknown. It's that process that's the sort of the answer to the meta-morality. And it's the society that gives the most freedom to do this behavior. That is sort of that's the best society. He doesn't state it as explicitly, but to me, well, he writes it quite in a nuanced way, but he states it as the following: culture is a structure aimed toward the attainment of certain ends in the immediate present and over the longer course of time, As such, a given cultural structure necessarily must meet a number of stringent and severely constrained requirements. 1. It must be self-maintaining. 2. It must be sufficiently flexible to allow for constant adaptation to constantly shifting environmental circumstances. And 3. It must acquire the allegiance of the individuals who compose it. So, the absolute, so to say, is the society that helps their individual heroes to balance as well as possible their journey between the known and the unknown, and to consistently adapt towards the new things they bring back from the unknown. And that's interesting, right? It's interesting first that he does not... So first, what's interesting is that he states a sort of relativism. So what's the highest value isn't fixed. What's the highest good isn't a fixed thing. Because it's the accumulation of behaviors of heroes, so individuals that balance between chaos and order, who together develop the highest value, so to say. And that's interesting, because to me that sounds a bit like relativism. Not in the sense that that everything is equal, but in the sense that the absolute can be socially constructed, or at least a highest value can be socially constructed. And the absolute in this case is, well, the best society possible that finds a way for its citizens to behave in the most free way to balance between order and chaos. So, to take a step back and to try to clarify this a bit, we have the individual who is cognitively structured in such a way that he's consistently busy with categorizing and ordering the unknown, and who is helped in this process via culture, mythology, stories, interaction with parents, interactions with playmates, interactions with just in general, the TV, the iPad. Every interaction that you have shapes meaning and helps you to structure the world. And then Peterson finds that within mythology, and nearly every mythology that he finds, you have the Great Mother, which is chaos, the Great Father, which is order, and the hero who balances out these two. And it's this process that consistently brings something new within life. And then this hero mythology is the highest sort of goal that we can achieve. So it's how everyone's life, according to Peterson, is structured. It's in line with this hero's mythology. But we all live within societies, and those societies, those must find a way to accommodate for those heroes to be, and to be shapen up well, and to be protected, and to have the necessary accommodations and resources to develop themselves, to be secure enough to step outside the border of the known and of culture into the unknown. And via this consistent process, we develop norms, we develop morality, we develop a utopia, sort of. That's how I have read Peterson. And if this still is a bit vague, I will post the whole script on the website. Please have a look. Reread it a couple of times. Maybe it helps. The difficult things, or I wouldn't say critiques, but the things that I find quite difficult is the jumping around of Peterson between biology and culture. So what I find quite difficult, especially online, for example, his Twitter feud on objective morality, or sorry, objective beauty, I find it quite difficult. So for example, if you read Maps of Meaning, you find a very socially constructivist Peterson. You find a Peterson that is that has statements like all meaning, or well, I wouldn't I'm not going to say that he exactly states it like this, but all meaning is constructed from interactions, and that everything that we sort of do within life surrounds around meaning, and that this social aspect is very important. So then we have this Peterson, and then on Twitter we have the Peterson that states that there are, well, factually certain standards that are objectively beautiful. Well, I would say that I personally think that culture shapes most of the things that I find beautiful. And I think my girlfriend is objectively beautiful, but I am very much sure that the clothing that she wears and the specific things that and how she interacts with me, that is very much culturally shaped. So those things I found a bit difficult, because I would say that Peterson in this book is way more socially constructivist. And then I was reading online on critiques that I could find, and what I found especially interesting is that the meta-mythology of the hero, which is Peterson's absolute truth, is not found within Chinese philosophy or Chinese mythology. So I was wondering if indeed this hero's journey or hero's mythology is applicable to all mythologies, and if it isn't, what that then does for his statements and the generalizability of his claims. And then I wanted to say that the question around morality is quite vague, and I think that this is where most of his more left-wing criticisms can be made, and I agree with. So what we talked about is that every culture has the same mythologies, and everybody seems to work with stories and mythologies to shape the way that they think. And then we came to the conclusion that the culture that best facilitates the hero's journey is, in a certain sense, the best society. And then from the behavior of the hero, who consistently sort of mediates between chaos and order, we together come to morality and norms. However, Peterson also states that society, which is the accumulation of thousands of people who walk this hero's journey, is a good guidance on how to behave within the world. And he also mentions in the book that this is what he appreciates about conservatives. They sort of understand this value. They understand the value, or they understand the value that society has as accumulation of ways on being that have been given over generations to new generations and generations and generations. So it's the accumulation of behavior that sort of works and that is brought over from generations to generations. And this is sort of the conservative tendency within Peterson, I think, is that he consistently looks to society for a sense of guidance, and sees society as a social construct that has been working for centuries. And so because it has been working for centuries, there is a certain truth in it that we should not demolish and that we should use and that we should appreciate, sort of. And to be fair, he doesn't say that we should, for example, accept the tyrannical father, so the very controlling state. However, I still find this a bit difficult, because it does make him a bit conservative, and it does make me wonder where you draw the line between what's acceptable, sort of what are acceptable traditions to which you should look back for guidance, and what isn't. And this is also a critique that I will give a bit later on. But to me, then, Peterson is a classical liberal, in the sense that he lays a lot of emphasis on the individual. So also a society is based on individuals that walk through the hero's journey, but it's all around the individual. And the state is there purely to function as a guidance and to help us gain more freedom, sort of. Well, his conservative tendency we talked about. And then his Christian roots. Well, I would say that his Christian roots are found in how he predominantly focuses on the Bible as the structure for broader Western society. And well, this is one thing that I found especially difficult, and I will just read it now. While Peterson does not explicitly, as a fundamentalist, looks at the Bible as the ultimate true source of guidance in life, he does see in it a mythology that has been passed down from generations and should therefore hold a certain truth and value that has been valued for centuries. The amount of which Peterson conservatively wants to hold on to certain stories of the Bible as important for the current days is left open. This is maybe what left-leaning critics find bothersome, since he does not make this explicit. Where is the border between interesting mythological inspirations from the Bible and conservatively leaning on it as a guide for broader society? So where do you draw the border between tradition, guidance, and a suffocating structure? And now that he joined Daily Wire, I am more worried that the more fundamentalist view on the Bible is gaining more presence in his works. Well, I'm thinking about this, and I cannot make sufficient statements about this now, but this is what worries me, sort of. And of course, there are other critiques on Peterson, critiques that I'm not familiar with enough, and which I'm, well, curious to hear. However, I hope that you find this small video essay interesting, and well, I found it worthwhile to work through the book and to indeed find sort of his conservative leanings within this magnum opus. Well, being already present in this book helped me to understand where we are now. So yes, thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you next time.